The hubris of history's greatest commanders. On a bitter December morning in 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the edge of the Berezina River, watching the remnants of his once magnificent Grande Armée struggle through the icy waters. Just 6 months earlier, he had led 500,000 men into Russia, Europe's greatest fighting force, resplendent in their uniforms, confident in their invincibility. Now, barely 50,000 remained, their gold eagles and brass buttons traded for scraps of blankets, their proud march reduced to a desperate scramble for survival. The Emperor of France had made a catastrophic miscalculation, one that would end his dream of continental dominion. Yet he was hardly alone in the pantheon of military hubris. History's greatest commanders share a peculiar trait. They all believed they were different, that they alone could defy the iron laws of warfare that had crushed their predecessors. Roman General Varus ignored warnings of Germanic treachery, marching 3 legions to their doom in the Teutoburg forest. Hitler, despite having Napoleon's cautionary tale before him, repeated the same devastating winter campaign against Russia with equally catastrophic results. A Byzantine commander's simple failure to lock a gate led to the fall of Constantinople after 9 centuries of impregnability. These weren't just military defeats, they were world-altering blunders that redirected the course of civilization itself, each one a stark reminder that even the mightiest empires can be undone by a single, fatal mistake. The fall of Varus, a turning point in Roman history. The Germanic chieftain Arminius watched silently as Roman standards glinted in the afternoon sun, their golden eagles catching the light as they bobbed above the endless column of legionnaires. He allowed himself a slight smile. The Romans, in their magnificent arrogance, had no idea they were already dead men. Publius Quintilius Varus, governor of Germania and personal friend of Emperor Augustus, rode at the head of his column with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, represented the finest military machine ever created, nearly 20,000 men trained to fight as one. The Roman general's only concern was how to spend the vast wealth he expected to extract from these barbaric territories. Varus had already grown rich governing Syria through a combination of heavy taxation and brutal efficiency. Germania, he assumed, would prove no different. What Varus couldn't grasp was that his most trusted advisor was orchestrating his destruction. Arminius, son of the Carusi chief, had spent his youth as a hostage in Rome, learning the empire's ways and earning his citizenship and rank as a Roman knight. The Romans saw this as proof of their successful civilizing mission. In reality, Arminius had spent those years studying Roman tactics, cataloging their weaknesses, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment arrived in September of 9 CE. Using his position as Varus's trusted scout, Arminius fabricated reports of a local uprising that required Roman attention. The route he suggested would take the legions through Teutoburg forest, a nightmare of dense woods, narrow paths, and sodden ground. When Varus received warnings about Arminius's loyalty from Segestes, another Germanic chief, he dismissed them outright. The very idea that a Roman-educated knight would betray the empire seemed absurd. The first day in the forest passed without incident, though the going was slow. The Roman column stretched for nearly 12 miles, not just soldiers, but engineers, servants, camp followers, and wagons laden with supplies. Heavy rains had turned the forest floor into a morass. The Germans, watching from the ridgelines, waited with the patience of hunters as the Romans struggled deeper into their trap. The attack, when it came, defied every principle of warfare the Romans understood. There was no pitched battle, no glorious clash of armies. Instead, spears and rocks rained down from the ridges. Trees, felled in advance, crashed across the Roman line of march. The narrow path prevented the legions from forming their famous fighting squares. Varus's mighty army had been reduced to a thin line of men thrashing in the mud, unable to effectively fight back against an enemy they could barely see. By the third day, the Roman force had disintegrated. The precise military machine had become a mass of terrified men fighting for survival. Varus, finally grasping the magnitude of his failure, fell on his sword, the traditional Roman response to catastrophic defeat. The Germans methodically hunted down the survivors. They took no prisoners except a few to be sacrificed to their gods. The golden eagles of the legions, symbols of Rome's inviolable might, were captured and hidden away in Germanic holy places. When word reached Rome, Emperor Augustus was so shaken that he would sometimes wake in the night, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The numbers of the 3 lost legions were never used again in the Roman army. More significantly, the defeat established the Rhine as the permanent boundary of Roman power. The empire would never again attempt significant expansion into Germania. The greatest irony lay in what Varus had failed to see. His catastrophic defeat stemmed not from the Germans' rejection of Roman civilization, but from their mastery of it. Arminius had learned from Rome the arts of deception, organization, and strategic thinking. He had turned Rome's greatest strengths, its confidence, its predictability, its very civilization, into weapons against it. In doing so, he had changed the course of European history, ensuring that there would always be a Germanic Europe independent of Latin influence. Today, deep in Teutoburg Forest, archaeologists still uncover gruesome evidence of those 3 days of slaughter, bent weapons, shattered bones, and corroded armor. But Varus's most enduring legacy isn't found in these artifacts. It lives on in the cultural boundary he inadvertently created, a line still visible today in the languages, laws, and customs that divide the Latin and Germanic peoples of Europe. The fall of Constantinople, a forgotten door. Sultan Mehmed II pressed his spyglass to his eye at dawn on May 29, 1453, scanning Constantinople's mighty walls for any sign of weakness. For 47 days, his cannons had hammered the defenses that had protected Byzantium for a millennium. The 19-year-old Ottoman ruler had brought an army of 150,000 men and the largest artillery train ever assembled, yet the city still stood. But what caught his attention that morning wasn't the result of his sophisticated siege engines. It was a simple wooden door, carelessly left ajar. The Kirkeporta Gate, a small postern door used for occasional sorties, had been forgotten in the chaos of the previous night's fighting. While Emperor Constantine V rallied his exhausted men at the main breach near the Blacherne walls, this insignificant entrance, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass abreast, stood unguarded. Through his spyglass, Mehmed watched as 50 of his elite janissaries crept toward the opening, their white turbans ghostly in the morning mist. Inside the city, the situation was desperate. Constantine had barely 7,000 defenders to cover 14 miles of walls. The population, once numbering in the millions during Byzantium's golden age, had dwindled to barely 50,000. The emperor had stripped the copper from church roofs to make weapons, melted down sacred vessels for coin, and posted priests alongside professional soldiers on the ramparts. The night before, he had led a solemn procession through the streets, praying before the icons in Hagia Sophia one last time. The first anyone knew of the disaster was when the janissaries began appearing on the walls themselves, raising their crimson flag and opening other gates from within. Constantine, hearing the commotion, turned from the main breach to see Ottoman troops already pouring into his city. In that moment, he knew 1,000 years of Roman history in the East had come to an end. Throwing off his purple boots, the symbol of imperial power, he led a final desperate charge into the mass of Turkish soldiers. What followed was more than just the sack of a city. It was the death of an empire that had preserved Greco-Roman civilization through the Dark Ages. As Ottoman troops surged through the streets, the last Byzantine scholars fought to save what they could. Precious manuscripts were hastily stuffed into sacks, loaded onto ships, and smuggled to the west. This desperate exodus would help spark the Italian Renaissance, as ancient knowledge found new homes in Venice, Florence, and Rome. Mehmed, entering the conquered city that evening, rode directly to Hagia Sophia. Dismounting at the greatest church in Christendom, he bent down and scooped up a handful of earth, pouring it over his turban, a gesture of humility in his moment of triumph. He ordered an immediate halt to the looting and declared the building would be preserved as a mosque. Then he climbed to the dome and gazed out over his new capital. Constantinople, now Istanbul, would become the seat of a new empire that would rule the eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. The fall of Constantinople pivoted world history on a forgotten door. The Muslim world gained control of the Bosphorus Strait, severing Europe's direct trade routes to Asia and forcing explorers like Columbus to seek new paths west. The flood of Byzantine scholars to Italy seeded the Renaissance, and the threat of Ottoman expansion would reshape European politics for centuries as Christian powers struggled to check the advance of this vigorous new empire. In the end, the mighty walls of Constantinople, which had repelled Persians, Arabs, Russians, and Bulgars, fell not to Mehmed's massive cannons, but to a simple failure of attention. It was a brutal reminder that in war, no detail is too small to matter. A single unlocked gate, overlooked in the heat of battle, had changed the face of 3 continents. Napoleon's winter nightmare, a turning point in warfare. Moscow is surely the most beautiful city in the world, Marshal Joachim Murat declared as he gazed at the Russian capital from the Sparrow Hills. The September sun glinted off hundreds of golden domes, and the ancient towers of the Kremlin rose majestically above the sprawling metropolis. Napoleon's cavalry commander had every reason to feel triumphant. The Grande Armée had marched over 1,000 miles, fought and won multiple battles, and now stood ready to claim their greatest prize. But as Murat raised his telescope for a closer look, he noticed something odd. No smoke rose from a single chimney. The city appeared completely deserted. What followed would become the stuff of nightmares. Count Rostopchin, Moscow's governor, had enacted a scorched earth policy of devastating brilliance. As Napoleon's troops entered the silent streets, they found houses rigged with time-delayed incendiary devices. That night, fires erupted simultaneously across the city. The French soldiers, instead of enjoying the comfortable winter quarters they'd been promised, found themselves fighting flames in a howling wind. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his prize went up in smoke, the heat so intense it cracked the windows of his temporary palace. The emperor had based his entire campaign on a fundamental miscalculation. He assumed Tsar Alexander I would sue for peace once his capital fell, as every other European monarch had done. But the Russians had learned from their previous defeats. They understood Napoleon's army lived off the lands it conquered, requiring massive amounts of forage and supplies. By destroying Moscow and its stockpiles, they denied him both a bargaining chip and the means to feed his army. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in the charred ruins, sending increasingly desperate peace offers to St. Petersburg. Each was met with silence. His generals begged him to retreat while autumn weather still held. The emperor, for the first time in his career, seemed paralyzed by indecision. When he finally ordered the withdrawal on October 19th, the first snowflakes were already falling. What followed was not a military retreat, but an apocalypse on ice. The Grande Armée's legendary discipline disintegrated as temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Horses died by the thousands, forcing the abandonment of artillery and supply wagons. Soldiers burned their eagles and standards to stay warm. The dead were stripped of clothing before their bodies froze solid. Veterans who had survived a dozen campaigns were killed not by bullets, but by the simple act of falling asleep in the snow. Russian Cossacks swooped in daily, picking off stragglers and raiding supply columns. But General Winter proved a far deadlier enemy. Men's breath froze in their beards. Leather straps became brittle and snapped. Wine and brandy turned to slush in the bottles. At the Berezina River crossing, French engineers worked waist-deep in freezing water to build bridges, knowing they were sacrificing their lives for their comrades. Many died where they stood, frozen in place like statues. The final toll defied comprehension. Of the 422,000 men who crossed the Niemen River with Napoleon in June, only 10,000 marched out in formation 5 months later. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across the vast Russian wilderness. More importantly, the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Within 18 months, a coalition of European powers would force his abdication and exile. The Russian campaign marked the first time Napoleon had faced an enemy who refused to play by his rules. The Tsar and his generals had discovered that the key to defeating the French emperor was to deny him the decisive battle he craved. By trading space for time, destroying their own resources, and letting winter do their killing, they had defeated the greatest military genius of the age without winning a single major engagement. This new form of warfare, where civilians bore the brunt of military strategy and entire nations were mobilized for total war, would become the template for conflicts to come. Napoleon's catastrophic blunder had unknowingly ushered in the age of modern warfare, where the distinction between soldier and civilian, frontline and homeland, would increasingly blur. His frozen army had marched straight from the 18th century into the brutal realities of the 20th. The blunder of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's miscalculation. On June 22, 1941, the largest invasion force in human history crossed the Soviet border. 3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft launched Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. As German planes struck Soviet airfields, the Führer sat in his office, convinced he was about to destroy Bolshevism in a single devastating blow. That morning he told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." What Hitler failed to grasp wasn't just military strategy. It was the fundamental transformation of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Deep in the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, Soviet industry had been quietly preparing for this moment for years. Entire factories had been built in duplicate, ready to be dismantled and moved east at a moment's notice. Within weeks of the invasion, an industrial exodus began that would dwarf any peacetime movement of machinery in history. The Germans advanced rapidly through the summer, encircling massive Soviet formations in spectacular victories. But with each triumph, the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into a continent-sized trap. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov employed a strategy of planned withdrawal, trading space for time. Behind the front lines, over 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto railway cars and shipped east. Machinery often began production again, while the factory walls were still being built around them. By autumn, the first signs of trouble appeared. German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Tanks broke down on rutted Russian roads, their engines clogged with dust. The Soviet scorched earth policy left the invaders with nothing to forage. Most critically, Hitler's obsession with capturing symbolic targets diverted forces from strategic objectives. His insistence on taking Kiev, while militarily successful, delayed the drive on Moscow by precious weeks. October brought the Rasputitsa, the season of rain and mud. German mechanized units ground to a halt in seas of muck. Horse-drawn supply wagons sank up to their axles. The Soviet T-34 tank, with its broad tracks designed for these conditions, proved devastatingly effective. German tank commanders were shocked to find their shells bouncing off the T-34's sloped armor, while their own tanks proved vulnerable to Soviet fire. The real disaster struck in December. The Wehrmacht had no winter clothing. Hitler had insisted the campaign would be over by autumn. German soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: curtains, tablecloths, women's fur coats. Tank engines refused to start in the cold. Diesel fuel gelled. automatic weapons ceased functioning. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, clad in quilted uniforms and felt boots, launched counterattack after counterattack. Most devastating was Hitler's no-retreat order. When Soviet forces threatened to encircle German positions, experienced commanders begged to withdraw to defensible lines. Hitler refused, insisting that every inch of captured ground be held. Entire divisions were sacrificed to this mandate, including the 6th Army at Stalingrad. 290,000 men lost because their Führer wouldn't allow a strategic withdrawal. Behind German lines, the Soviet partisans waged a ruthless guerrilla campaign. Rail lines were sabotaged, supply dumps destroyed, and German units harassed constantly. Unlike other conquered territories, the vast spaces of Russia gave resistance fighters endless places to hide. The brutality of Nazi occupation policies ensured a constant stream of recruits to the partisan cause. The ultimate irony lay in Hitler's fundamental misreading of Soviet society. Far from collapsing, the communist system proved remarkably resilient under stress. The centralized economy, so inefficient in peacetime, was perfectly suited for total war. Stalin could direct all resources toward the war effort without concern for consumer needs or public opinion. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing more tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces than all of German-occupied Europe combined. Hitler's invasion transformed the Soviet Union from a pariah state into a superpower. The forced industrialization of the 1930s, accomplished at a terrible human cost, had created an industrial base that, once fully mobilized, outmatched Germany's war economy. American Lend-Lease aid, flowing through Persian Gulf ports and across the Arctic to Murmansk, added crucial support to this industrial might. The Soviet Union that emerged from the war was no longer just a revolutionary state. It was a military-industrial colossus that would dominate half of Europe for the next 40 years. America's intelligence failure, the catalyst of change. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7, 1941, two privates manning the new SCR-270 mobile radar station at Opana Point, Hawaii, noticed something extraordinary. Their radar screen showed a massive collection of aircraft approaching from the north. They immediately called the information center at Fort Shafter. The response from the lieutenant on duty would echo through history. "Don't worry about it." The lieutenant assumed they were tracking a scheduled arrival of B-17 bombers from California. He failed to notice that the incoming formation was 5 times larger than expected, or that it was approaching from the wrong direction. This missed connection between two low-ranking soldiers who saw something suspicious and a mid-level officer who dismissed it perfectly exemplified the cascade of errors that would lead to America's greatest military disaster. The Japanese strike force had achieved the impossible. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, and 23 submarines had crossed 4,000 miles of Pacific Ocean without detection. They had maintained complete radio silence, refueled at sea, and navigated through storm-tossed waters while avoiding all commercial shipping lanes. The American intelligence community, convinced that no carrier force could operate so far from its home waters, had dismissed the possibility entirely. Warnings had been piling up for months. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, revealing increasingly hostile intentions. Radar stations and patrol boats had reported unusual activities. The Japanese embassy in Hawaii was burning documents in its courtyard. Senior military officials dismissed each signal, trapped in their own preconceptions about Japanese capabilities and intentions. The Pacific Fleet's ships remained neatly lined up in harbor, their crews enjoying their Sunday morning routines. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida broke radio silence with the code words that would launch the modern American era. Tora. 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 The first wave of 183 aircraft, maintaining perfect formation, swept in from the north. Harbor anti-aircraft batteries stood unmanned. Ammunition lockers remained locked. Fighter planes sat wingtip to wingtip on airfield tarmacs, presenting perfect targets. The devastation was surgical. Japanese pilots, extensively trained for this single mission, struck with precision. Armor-piercing bombs, specially modified to penetrate the deck armor of capital ships, found their marks. Torpedo bombers, flying dangerously low, launched their weapons into the shallow harbor waters, something American experts had deemed impossible. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne found themselves overwhelmed by the professional Japanese pilots. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans dead, 18 ships sunk or damaged, 347 aircraft destroyed. But the real damage was to American strategic assumptions. The attack shattered the illusion of American invulnerability, protected by vast oceans and superior technology. It exposed fatal flaws in military intelligence gathering, inter-service communication, and strategic planning. Yet the Japanese success contained the seeds of their ultimate defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the reluctant architect of the attack, had warned his government that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year. But rather than destroying America's will to fight, Pearl Harbor galvanized it. The surprise attack transformed American isolationism into a fury for total war overnight. Most crucially, the Japanese had missed their most important targets. The Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were all at sea on December 7th. The base's fuel storage tanks, containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, remained untouched. The dry docks and repair facilities, which would prove crucial in rebuilding the fleet, were largely undamaged. Within months, Pearl Harbor would become the launching pad for America's Pacific counteroffensive. The Pearl Harbor attack reshaped American military thinking. Never again would US forces rely solely on peacetime assumptions about enemy capabilities. The modern American intelligence community, with its vast resources and overlapping safeguards, was built directly on the lessons of that Sunday morning. The mantra, "Never again," led to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and a global network of early warning systems. The ultimate paradox of Pearl Harbor was that an attack designed to keep America out of World War II instead turned the United States into a permanent global military power. The isolation that Japan sought to enforce had precisely the opposite effect, transforming America into a nation that would maintain forward military bases across the globe. A single morning of strategic miscalculation had unleashed forces that would reshape the entire post-war world order. The price of pride, lessons from military disasters. History's greatest military disasters share a haunting symmetry. In each catastrophe, we find commanders who confuse their maps with the territory, their hopes with reality, their pride with capability. From Varus to MacArthur, from Bonaparte to Hitler, the fatal flaw remains constant: the unshakable belief that they would be the exception to war's ancient rules. But perhaps the most chilling lesson from these calamities is how little the fundamental nature of military hubris has changed. Today's generals command drone swarms instead of legions, cyber warriors instead of cavalry. They plot campaigns on digital screens rather than paper maps. Yet they face the same eternal temptations: to underestimate their enemies, to overvalue their technology, to believe that this time will be different. The United States' 20-year engagement in Afghanistan eerily echoes ancient Rome's frontier wars, proof that even superpowers can be undone by tribal fighters who refuse to play by conventional rules. Modern militaries study these historical blunders obsessively, building vast simulation systems and war games around their lessons. Yet somehow, each generation manages to find fresh ways to repeat old mistakes. The Maginot Line's builders forgot that static defenses always fail against innovative attackers. American planners in Vietnam, like Varus in Germania, fatally misunderstood the cultural terrain they were fighting in. Russian commanders in Ukraine, Like Napoleon's marshals, watch their elaborate battle plans shatter against the raw determination of a people fighting for their homeland. These catastrophes remind us that military genius often contains the seeds of its own destruction. The very qualities that make commanders successful, supreme confidence, iron determination, absolute conviction in their methods, can become lethal weaknesses when circumstances change. Patton's aggressive genius, perfect for the race across France, would have been disastrous in the jungle warfare of the Pacific. The bold decisiveness that made MacArthur a hero in World War II led to his downfall in Korea. Yet there is hope in this dark symmetry. Each disaster taught lessons written in blood, forging stronger, more adaptable military institutions. The Teutoburg Forest taught Rome to respect its enemy's capabilities. Pearl Harbor birthed modern intelligence gathering. The Russian campaign showed the limitations of even the most brilliant tactical genius against strategic depth and national will. The next great military blunder is already taking shape somewhere in the world, waiting to be triggered by pride, miscalculation, or simple human error. But perhaps by studying these ancient failures, we can recognize the warning signs before disaster strikes. In an age of nuclear weapons and instant global communication, the price of such lessons has become too high to learn firsthand. For in the end, the greatest military truth remains unchanged since the days of Varus. No army is invincible, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and victory goes not to the strongest, but to those who best understand their own limitations. The most dangerous enemy a military commander faces is not across the battlefield. It is the face of certainty he sees in his own mirror.